Hello and welcome to the FCC Next Steps podcast. My name is Jordan. I am the lead pastor at First Christian Church in Monmouth. And this is a podcast where we get to bring you a little extra discipleship opportunity and information just to kind of squeeze in some study into maybe your lunch hour, maybe your morning routine. We're not real sure. Whenever you fit it in, we aim to bring 20, 30 minutes of good discipleship content to you. So if you're just joining us, this is episode 5, I believe, maybe episode 6, I lost track. But we are going to be looking at, or rather continuing a study through the creation story in Genesis chapter 1, taking kind of a deeper dive beyond just your Sunday school material, looking at some academic information, some language information, cultural information, and maybe bring this story and its theology and its significance into our lives to make it maybe a little more relevant. So like I said, we are picking up in session 5 today, talking about the filling, or rather the forming days of the creation story. A little recap: in our last session, we talked about how there's a structure to the story. The main problem is that creation is formless and empty, or the Hebrew words tohu and vabohu. And so the next several verses and the next several sessions of our podcast are going to see how the story addresses those problems, or rather how God addresses those problems. So in today's session, we're going to be looking at chapter 1, verses 3 through 13, looking at those forming days, those first 3 days of creation. We're going to be talking about what is good. At the end of every one of these days, God looks at what he's done and he says, it is good. And it's important that we understand what that means and what that doesn't mean. And then finally, we're going to recap and learn a few lessons about creation from the creation story and maybe bring some enrichment to our lives from those. So we're going to get started by looking at verses 3 through 5. It goes like this. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So we have to, at the outset of each of these creation days, ask ourselves, what exactly is being created? We saw that God created light, or rather he separated the light from the darkness. And so if you remember back in verse 2, we had this problem where the Spirit of God hovers over the surface of the deep and there was darkness. So darkness is something that's already present in the story. And so what we read here, if we want to go back at the text and look at it, is there was a separation. So I don't want us to envision, and I'm going to say this several times, I don't want us to envision that God speaking and then out of nowhere sort of light just appears, but rather there is a separation from darkness. And so it's hard to conceptualize, but an intermingling of light and dark in this chaotic, unformed, ungood, primordial world. God speaks and the light separates from the darkness. Now, the darkness doesn't go away, and that's important to note too. Darkness is not a threat. Even at the beginning of the story in verse 2, where the deep is this dark, primordial, chaotic sea, darkness does not represent a threat to God. In fact, he includes it and continues to support it as part of his creation. He has purpose for it. And the separation of light and dark, it gives some order and some form. And he calls the day, or the light, day, and the darkness night. Neither one of those are bad. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves of that, because even in our symbolism today, and certainly throughout the ancient world, darkness is oftentimes synonymous with something that is evil, or something that is crooked, or something that is an antithesis to God in some way. We talk about the powers of darkness and so on. But in the creation, the darkness is very much a part of God's plan. It's not a threatening, malevolent entity. And we also need to note here that God is not trapped by this construct of time that he creates. He stands apart from it and above it, but he creates time. And we have to maybe start to wonder here at the beginning of this story, what is time for? I mean, we have day and we have night. God didn't really seem to need those things. And this is maybe our first clue that creation has a purpose. There is a grander scheme and a grander aim at mind here, and that it's meant to benefit something or someone in particular. And then one final note of this creation day. We need to make note here that God doesn't create the sun and the moon. He creates light, or rather, he separates light from dark. And the picture here, the mental image, is of just light being its own thing. There's no source of light. There's no sun. There's no burning ball of gas a billion miles away. There's nothing from which the light emanates. It just exists, distinct from any sun, moon, or light source. And that should probably be another indication that what we're looking at is not a picture or a cosmology of the universe that you and I, in our modern context, might initially imagine. Because in our minds, every light has a source from which that light emanates. Light is energy, it's a waveform, you know. But here, light is its own thing, distinct from any source. And so, in darkness also is not the absence of a light source. It exists as its own thing, as the backdrop of which the sun and moon will later hang. And so that's a very different picture, not a very scientific picture of the world. And that is worth noticing, but shouldn't bother us at all because, again, this story is not trying to describe for us the material origins of the world according to our modern 21st century scientific expectations. It is a story of its own time in an ancient Near Eastern mindset that very much saw creation differently than we do. But even here in the Genesis story, we're starting to see that the biblical account stands apart from these ancient Near Eastern accounts, even in the fact that darkness is not a threatening thing. And that continues to hold true. All those themes continue to hold true when we move forward and we look at verses 6 through 8 and the second creation day. It goes on to say, and God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water. And so God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it, and it was so. And God called the expanse sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. So we have here the creation of, and this is the 1984 translation of the NIV, and I use that only because I'm very partial to it. Not for any academic reasons, just for very sentimental reasons. But the word sky here is what describes what's being created, or at least that's how our translators have described it. The Hebrew word is the word rakia. And rakia is not exactly the sky as you or I would think about it. The rakia, we covered this in an earlier session, I believe, would refer to, and it's kind of debated, it's either the solid dome structure that stretches across what we would call the sky, or it is the expanse between the waters below and the solid dome structure above. And so it's not the air as you or I would think of it. And we need to remember, too, that what's being created here, what's being depicted, is not what you or I probably initially think, where we think of a spherical earth and the waters below obviously would be like the oceans. And then that, you know, our modern model and cosmology kind of make that issue of waters above very puzzling. What would that be referring to? If you remember back to a previous session, we talked about how the ancient Near East viewed the world as flat, kind of reminiscent of the picture that's on the screen if you're watching the video. And there were waters, the kind of endless primordial sea all around this flat earth, with the land really being in the middle of the flat earth. And there's solid dome structure stretching across the entirety of this flat earth. And then above that dome were the heavenly waters. And then heaven sat on top of that celestial sea. And that's pretty ubiquitous of ancient Near Eastern cultures and mythology and cosmologies. In fact, if you were to go back, I should have put the pictures on here, I apologize. But if you were to go back and look at, I believe it was like session 2 or 3, where we talked about the cosmology of the world, there was a Babylonian picture in which there's like the waters below, and then the rakia, and then the waters above, and then the heavens, the divine realm, sit or float atop that celestial sea. And that was a pretty common ancient understanding of the universe, even up into the New Testament era. You think about the book of Revelation, one of the last, or not the last, but there's a scene of heaven. Oh gosh, what chapter is it? It might be chapter 5 or it might be 14, one of those, but it's a depiction of heaven. And John is taken up to heaven and he sees this sea as if glass, or even some translations say a sea of glass. And at the center was the throne of God and the bows of light shining like emeralds. Well, that sea like glass, that's not, glass. What that is a picture of the heavenly waters. And at the center of the heavenly waters is God's throne. And the reason that the sea looks like glass is because the peace of God's presence has completely and utterly stilled any remnant of chaos that may have been conceivable. He has brought complete order and stillness and peace through his presence in the heavenly abode. That's the picture there. And so this imagery, it can be traced even relatively late in the timeline as you or I might think of it. So anyway, we've got the creation, we've got the world, there's light and it's separated from dark, and here we have the waters below separated from the waters above. And again, separated is the right word. Imagine like there's no land. There's just this mass of chaos and water, and God essentially speaks, and from the middle it separates, and some of the cosmic chaos goes down and forms the sea, and some of it goes up and forms the heavenly sea. That's the image that's being depicted here. And this idea, the rakia, or the expanse, this is you or I kind of miss this because we're not super familiar with a lot of these ancient Near Eastern myths, but gods, excuse me, still getting over a cold, sorry. A lot of these ancient Near Eastern cultures, their sky gods were incredibly significant. Pictured on the screen is a picture of the god Anu, and he would have counterparts in Akkadian culture named Enlil. You've probably heard of Baal or Baal. He was pretty popular in Phoenicia and really throughout the Mesopotamian world. And these were all sky gods or storm gods or some god that was synonymous with the sky. And these were also the gods that held the power to establish or depose kings. And so there was tremendous authority and power associated with these sky gods. And what we see in the creation story of Genesis is that God speaks this sky into existence, this great power that people recognized in the air. It finds its origin not in some other deity, but in him. And it's also not the manifestation of some other deity. It is an immaterial, or it's rather an inanimate thing that God made. And so it's very different than from how basically everybody in the ancient world would have understood the sky. And the core distinction is that it is Yahweh, the God of Israel, who holds this power, not any other deity. That brings us to the third forming day. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. And God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. And the land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. So again, what's being created here? What's being formed? When we ended day 2, which by the way is the only creation day that is not called good. And we'll talk about why that is in just a minute. But he finishes the second creation day, so there's just a bunch of water. And then God speaks, and again, we may imagine like continents forming or coming into existence or something, but I want us to understand that the image here that would have been understood by ancient people was sort of water rising up from the middle of this celestial sea. So there's water, and then the land sort of crests and breaks the surface tension, and then it sort of just arises as the water separates, as it sort of reveals the land. And what's really important about understanding that picture is that it explains a lot of the significance of mountains throughout Scripture and in ancient cultures. We'll get there in a minute. So mountains. These are oftentimes considered holy places. And if you just think through the biblical story for a moment, how many significant stories happen on mountains? You've got the affirmation of the covenant on Mount Gerizim before the Israelites enter into the Promised Land. Before that, you've got Moses going up on Mount Sinai and meeting God and receiving the Ten Commandments. Jerusalem is built on Mount Zion. Elijah, he has the showdown with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. There's always a mountain here. And even if you read through the Psalms, you'll hear this phrase, the mountain of God, or who can ascend the mountain? And it's assumed that God's presence is somewhere tied to that mountain. And that's because it was. In the minds of the people anyway, mountains were places where you went to meet God. And that was true outside of Israel as well. If we were to look at like Babylonian culture, maybe you've heard of ziggurats before. These were sort of pyramid structures, terraced pyramids, so that they kind of form stair steps. Some of the oldest pyramid structures on Earth, by the way, and they had a flat top, but they were completely solid. They weren't hollow like the Egyptian pyramids. But the whole reason they built these ziggurats was you would ascend these little mountain-like structures. When you got to the top, that's where it was believed that the divine, the heavenly, and the terrestrial met. That's where the god, we'll say Marduk, for instance, would be seated and was reigning on top of that mountain structure. Or you can look at Egypt. The reason they built pyramids the shape that they did was because they reflect the Egyptian creation mythology, in which these primordial mounds, or these mountains, ascended from the seas of chaos. And you can see throughout cultures, mountains become very significant places. In fact, in the book of Ezekiel chapter 28, and I forget the verse, I want to say it's around verse 13 or 16, somewhere in there, Ezekiel is talking about Eden, and Eden, the Garden of Eden, is described as being sat atop the mountain of God. And so mountains are these very significant places where people encounter God's presence, because it's believed that mountains were the first places to emerge when the primordial seas separated and the land was revealed. That might have something to do with why Jesus goes up on a mountain at the Transfiguration as well. This idea of mountains as places where we meet the divine. That's just a little tidbit that kind of explains the biblical thought for us. But we have the land revealed, and then we see that it's covered in vegetation. And this vegetation reproduces very predictably according to its kind. And sometimes people want to look at that word kind, and they want to make a much bigger deal out of it than it really is, as if it somehow explains or is tied to the fossil record or anything like that, or to species of animals as we know them today. It just means kind. It's their variety. That's the Hebrew word. There's nothing particularly hidden or scientific about it. But what it describes is a very ordered creation. Vegetation, carrots are going to make carrots, potatoes are going to make potatoes, apples are going to make apples. You're not going to get bananas from a blackberry bush, and you're not going to plant corn and be surprised when mushrooms pop up. Creation is structured, and it functions predictably. And that is a running theme throughout this section, and even more so in the next three creation days, the filling days. Creation functions in a predictable way. It's not going to be chaotic. It's not going to be surprising or unexpected. It's very systematic. And that's part of what makes it good. Now, we mentioned at the beginning of our time, we're talking about the word good. What does it mean for something to be good? Sometimes, especially in the creation story, we assume that creation was perfect when God made it, that it was without flaw, without fault, without any imperfection or whatever. And sometimes we get that idea in part because of the writings of St. Augustine, who lived around 3rd, 4th century AD. Even more so, that idea is baked into our head because of a novel called Pilgrim's Progress that talks about Paradise Lost, I think. And it reaffirms this image of a perfect creation that was without flaw in any way. That's not what the Hebrew word means, though. The Hebrew word is tov. It's used a ton throughout the Old Testament. It's not a mysterious word. It has a range of meanings. It can mean good, pleasant, pleasing, good, fitting, fulfilling, purposeful. It can mean a lot of positive things. Essentially, it just means good. It doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't mean without flaw. It is never used to mean to ascribe some sort of moral perfection or anything. It just means good. And so when God looks at his creation days, he declares them to be good. And we might wonder, well, what does that mean exactly? And we get a bit of a clue when we notice that day 2 is not called good. It's the only one of the 6 creation days that is not good. On day 1, God separated light from dark. Essentially, there was time that functioned in a predictable way, and God said, that's good. And we might wonder why, because God's outside of time. He's pre-existent of that. He doesn't need time. He doesn't function according to the clock. You know, we read in 2 Peter that to the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. So what use for time does God have? Well, he doesn't. That's not what makes it good. But it is good for someone. We look at day 2, God separates the waters, and we notice that it's not good. Or at least it's not bad, but God never declares it to be good. And yet when we get to day 3, when the land arises and the vegetation fills the earth, now creation is good. And so when we look at this, we start to say, well, what could be accomplished now that there's land and vegetation that couldn't when there was just waters below and waters above? And in relation to that, what benefit does time add? What's the common thing tying all this together? We don't have the answer by the end of day 3. We will by the end of day 6, but you can probably see where this is going. What makes creation good is not some sort of moral state or a lack of flaw, but rather its purpose, its ability to function for God's intended goal. And that's a big thing to remember about ancient Near Eastern cultures. Creation is, and it's not just Israelites, in Akkadian, in Egyptian, in Sumerian, and all of these different cultures, creation and existence are a matter of function and purpose far more than material origins. You and I, when we think of existence, we think of where did it come from? What is it made of? We think of matter and, atoms and chemical composition and DNA. We think of physical things because we are a very materialistic society. And I don't mean that in like a consumer, go buy lots of stuff way. I mean, physical thing, material is a huge part of our worldview. That was far less so in the ancient world. By the way, that's why so many today struggle with the idea of spirituality and spiritual beings and so on, because they're not material as we think of it. But in the ancient world, they didn't think so much in material terms. And so spiritual realities were a given. It was far easier for them to comprehend and grasp those. Rather, existence for them seems to have dealt more with purpose and function. When something has a purpose, when it has a job, when it has a function, then it exists. And if you notice throughout the creation story, when God speaks, he says, let there be a thing, let there be light, for instance, and the light separates from dark, and he called the light day and the dark night. There's a function here now. There's a purpose tied to these things. Same thing with the dry land. It produces vegetation to reproduce according to its kind. Not just it comes into being, but it does something. And that's going to be even more evident in days 4 through 6 when he makes the heavenly bodies and then fills the sky and the sea and the dry land with creepy crawlies and stuff. There's purpose. That's the key. And that's what makes something good in this creation story. Does it fulfill the purpose that God has in store for it? If it does, it is good. So a little bit of reflection as we start to wrap this session up. Genesis chapter 1 is very much in line with ancient Near Eastern creation stories and culture. And again, I will reemphasize that during every session because we so often approach this story from our perspective and our culture with our expectations. And in doing that, we miss and misread and misunderstand and come up with all kinds of crazy ideas about the story that simply are not accurate. We need to understand this as an ancient book, not written to us or even for us, but that we get the benefit of reading and learning from. We also see Yahweh is not trapped in creation. This was very different from the ancient Near East and something that makes Genesis unique amongst its contemporaries. If you remember, we talked about in an earlier session, if I were to look up at the sun, if I lived in ancient Egypt and I looked at the sun, I'm not looking at a burning ball of gas. I'm looking at the manifestation of Ra. That is the sun god. That's not the way the world works, according to the Bible. God is not trapped in creation. He stands outside of it, apart from it, ruling over it. He tells it what to do. He gives it purpose and function. He's not trapped within it, and he's not subject to it. And finally, and we didn't say this explicitly, but we all kind of see where it's going. We see that creation has a purpose. It's for somebody, but it's not for the gods. If you remember some of those ancient Near Eastern creation myths we referenced in session 2, creation largely exists for the good of the gods, the benefit of them. Mankind exists to serve them. Genesis turns that whole thing on its head. Creation seems to be made for people, for mankind, not divinity. We're the ones that benefit from time. We're the ones that benefit from the predictability of plants reproducing by their kind. And even in the early stages of the story, we see that our God is a loving God that has tailored his world to facilitate our benefit and good. And that is an incredibly different message than any of the ancient stories that Israel would have heard from Egypt or Canaan or any of the other kingdoms. So Genesis, while using a lot of the images of the ancient world, has a very different message to say and to speak. So that's going to be it for our session today. Thanks you for tuning in. We hope that if you have any questions, that you'll make sure and email them, submit them either through the app, the email. You can call the office sometime, or if you can catch me in the hallway and ask, I'll do my best to give as short answers I can. I can tend to ramble on these things. But next section chapter 6, we're going to be getting into the filling days, looking at days 4 through 6 in the creation story and what those have to teach us about God and about our world today. So that's all we've got for this session. We hope you guys had a great time, and we'll catch you next time. Later.